In Virginia, a big election season is coming up, and a big part of that discussion is what will happen to the congressional maps in the Commonwealth. Just last week, Supreme Court here in the state ruled that a referendum can move forward on an April 21st vote where voters will decide whether or not they will allow for the change of congressional maps that could give Democrats more seats in the U.S. House out of Virginia. This is a big story that we're continuing to follow. It has so many different implications because the Supreme Court says that it won't make a decision until after that vote takes place. So joining us now, we have political expert Leslie Caughell, who is joining us. Thank you so much for being here. This is something I know for those of us who have covered politics or covered the process, this is such an interesting scenario here. Let's start with your interpretation of the Supreme Court's ruling. Anything that stuck out to you when they put that out there that said, hey, this could move forward, but we haven't made a decision yet?
Yeah, I think as we're kind of looking at the decision they handed down, one of the things that's really clear, I think, is they're aware of the political impact of this decision. And I kind of read the way they handed it down as saying, we want to do as little as possible, at least at this point, to weigh in on one side or another as to whether or not this moves forward, right? To completely shut this thing down, which they could have done essentially by saying the referendum can't move forward. So really, I think you have the Supreme Court here being asked to decide an important case and one with very real implications, but essentially politics moving forward as they kind of play with these weighty legal issues in really practically important ways for both state level politics and national politics. So I think I get the sense that you see the Supreme Court trying to be as nonpartisan as possible, maybe in a situation in which there's no way they can do it, right? So this is just so politically kind of partisan by design.
And, you know, I have a lot of questions, and we were talking about this as well. That the timeline of everything. So within the briefing that the Supreme Court gave out, they're not even asking for all of the finalized documents and information from both sides until after that April 21st timeframe in which the voters will be able to vote, which again gives us the understanding that a decision will take place afterwards. But Dr. Caughell, have you thought about the implications that could mean on both sides of the coin? Like, if they say ultimately no, what does that mean? If they say yes and the voters say no, there's so many different scenarios here. I'm a bit concerned of what it could mean for everybody.
Yeah, there are so many permutations to what could happen here. And I have to say, from a trust in government perspective, I just mentioned before, I think there's an element to which people want courts to be nonpartisan, right? And it would be really hard for the court not to look partisan if what happens is they come to a conclusion that's different than what the voters come to on referendum day. And they didn't ask for the first briefings in this case, I think, until the end of March. So I think that's a very clear indicator. We're going to vote on this referendum without knowing whether or not there's a constitutional legality to the referendum. There's so much here. And I also want to note, I think it's easy to get lost in the weeds and some of the politics of this and forget just the sheer importance nationally for this and the amount of money that is going to come into the state of Virginia on both sides. Because I think for both parties at a national level, they are looking at this particular referendum as something that could be make or break in terms of who keeps the House of Representatives. And if you're the kind of Republican administration in power right now, what the final 2 years of President Trump's term looks like. Because if Democrats get control in the House, you are going to see oversight and hearings into a lot of things that are going to take up a lot of oxygen.
You talked about the money. One of the groups, the main group that is now working to try to get this amendment passed, they put out immediately, in support of the decision that came down from the Supreme Court. But they had already put in $5 million, to support efforts to get this amendment done. Let's talk about, though, you kind of talked about the numbers game that we're now looking at from a national standpoint and giving some context to all of this at the moment. This is not something that's happening in a vacuum, as you said, Dr. Caughell. Obviously, this particular referendum is to whether or not we can change the congressional maps here. That would be more of a 10-1 in favor of Democrats, 10 Democrats and 1 Republican in terms of the districts that they're looking for. But we're looking at 4 new seats that Democrats think that they can get in this. But that's with Texas already changed theirs for 5. North Carolina changed theirs with 1. We have a few other states that have already done so, and then others that are looking potentially at doing it. Can I ask just your opinion of what we're seeing nationally with this kind of congressional arms race, so to speak? Have we seen anything like this before?
Yeah, so we have. In the 19th century, you saw the United States and political parties do something similar, which is these gerrymandering attempts, especially mid-cycle, to shore up power. Ultimately, what happened there is that you draw the maps in a way that seems like they benefit you and they will keep you in power indefinitely. But there's a shift in voters and there are these kind of wave elections. And what happens is you've drawn seats that make you weaker, because you've diluted the strength in some of your strong districts to add to your weaker districts, kind of to balance things out, right, to get more seats. Those are called dummy manders. And politicians run the risk of doing them when they draw maps in this way. So you're drawing maps often based on what voters have done in the past. That makes no guarantee for the future. And we're seeing this a little bit in Texas. I think there are some questions. Texas redrew its maps. And one of the things that they considered was the fact that President Trump was pulling in more Latino support in drawing those districts. They thought they were drawing stronger Republican districts. But if the poll numbers that we're looking at now that reflect the president really dramatically losing support in that community hold, then Texas might have drawn maps that aren't as strong for Republicans as what Republicans thought they were. Right, so this has happened in the past. I have to just say, though, somebody who follows politics, I think this is a really depressing thing to look at happening. And especially in Virginia 5 years ago, the voters essentially said, we don't like these gerrymandered maps. We want the kind of one person, one vote. We want our votes to matter as much as possible when we turn out on Election Day. And for all the difficulty we've had drawing maps, the fact that a purplish state had 5, and 6 as our congressional delegation, a pretty even split, I think is pretty reflective of Virginia voters. What I dislike seeing are maps that we see in places like North Carolina and Wisconsin, where you get one party getting 60% of the vote and like 20% of the seats, right? That disjuncture because of how the maps are drawn. This isn't great for democracy. Even as you can understand the partisan implications for everybody and why they want to do this.
And why they want to do it, the numbers, right? And we know that this started with the President Trump, really kind of calling for these Republican-led states to try to change their map so that they can get a wider advantage in the U.S. House. You kind of mentioned it, what we're looking at potentially for this midterm election. If it's anything like what we saw in Virginia, what we saw in New Jersey, obviously Republicans will be concerned about that and trying to keep their control moving ahead for the second half of the president's current term. But I believe the numbers right now we have within Congress is 218 Republicans to 213. We have a few of those seats that are currently unfilled. Looking at the numbers again, to kind of be a little bit clearer, though, you kind of talked to a few of them with Texas. Texas thought that they put it together to where they would have 5, but hearing from you, we don't know yet exactly what that's going to look like. In California, they also went ahead with theirs. Democrats there they changed their maps officially so where they would hopefully have another 5 there. You have Missouri with 1, Ohio with 2, those both for Republicans, North Carolina changing 1 in advantage for Republicans. So ultimately, we're going to see what happens this midterm. It is so important to look at it, but it's, to your point, Dr. Caughell, you mentioned kind of how depressing it is at this moment, right? When we're looking forward, not just here in Virginia, but beyond the next several years, What kind of precedent do you think this will set moving forward? Do you think we'll ever get back to a place where we don't look at elections the way that we currently are?
I mean, if I were to venture a guess, I think this stuff in American politics tends to work on kind of a pendulum. You go too far in one direction and you start to swing back. That's what happened in the 19th century when you had like the dummy manders, right? People were like, whoa, this isn't in our interest. And I would just say, to me, the kind of interesting states in this particular fight haven't necessarily been Virginia or California. I understand exactly why they're doing what they're doing. But they've been states like Indiana and Maryland, where you've clearly seen politicians say, I know the president wants this, or I know the party leader, Hakeem Jeffries, wants this, but we're not doing it because we don't think it's in our interest, either from an ethical perspective or from a purely kind of partisan political perspective. These, representatives understand that they are putting their seats at risk when they try to redraw these boundaries in ways that kind of divvy up voters from how they are currently organized. So I think we'll probably see a step back from this, but this isn't a great precedent, and it doesn't, make you feel really good about politics, particularly because I think it's hard for me to imagine when President Trump told Texas to redraw the map that he or somebody around him wasn't like, wait a minute, what is to keep other states from doing this? And once other states do this, it is not clear to me that the Republican Party has the advantage that they think they had. So I'm not sure what the point was in doing this. I don't know that after all of this happens and people start to feel even worse about politics, this is going to do anything to blunt what's likely to be an election that, Democrats do well in, just because historically, if you take away everything that's happening in terms of current events, the out party does better in midterm elections, and we have a pretty closely divided House. They were likely going to lose it anyway. I don't think this changes anything.
Now, just for clarity, the current way in which this referendum is constructed in Virginia, it is to be considered as temporary, right, for this, and also, and correct me if I'm wrong, triggered in certain cases. Can you explain that a little bit better?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So what this referendum does is essentially says if another state does this mid-cycle kind of redrawing of the maps for partisan reasons, which, by the way, the Supreme Court in 2019 said these partisan drawing of the maps is fine, right? If somebody else does it, we can do it, but that's not going to be forever. They've essentially put a sunset on when this particular kind of amendment would time out. So feasibly, if you wanted to do this again in 10 years, you'd have to pass another amendment. And I think that really is a testament to the fact that for Democrats, I think this felt a little funny because they know how voters feel about this. Many of the people who are supporting this ballot measure also supported the anti-gerrymandering ballot measure that Virginians just passed a few years ago. So I think in Virginia, at least, you've seen attempts to say, I don't know, we're going to do this, but, we're kind of holding our nose, right? We don't like this and we feel like we're doing this for practical political purposes, but we don't want this to be the way we do stuff going forward.
Obviously this comes on the heels of a separate court, a lower court here in Virginia, saying that this was illegal. You have former Attorney General here in the Commonwealth, Jason Miyares, who has continued to push, this is illegal. We believe that it's illegal. But obviously you also have on the Democratic side, House Speaker Don Scott, when this news came out and said, hey, this is going the way that we ultimately thought it was going to go, that voters will have the final say. Something I thought was interesting, and I don't know if you thought it was interesting as well, Dr. Caughell, is that in what the Virginia Supreme Court put out, they said the lower court's ruling didn't have any effect in their interpretation on what the timeline would be. What did you I know that's maybe getting into the weeds a little bit, but I just wanted to ask your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, as I was looking at this ruling, I think it was just very clear to me that I think the Supreme Court knows that they're handling like a bomb here.
Yes.
And I don't think they want to be the one holding it. And I think what you saw them do as best they could is carve out a space that said, we're going to try to deal with this really kind of interesting legal question about what Election Day means in the modern context when we don't just all vote on one day. we're going to decide that question, but we're going to pretend nothing else is going on around it. And that meant you had to kind of take out considerations about dates and the timeliness because this referendum is imminent, right? So it seemed to me like they were doing their best to be like, we're going to handle this legal question. We're going to ignore the political implications on the ground, which the lower court did not do.
Yeah, this is, I read through that and I thought that this entire thing was fascinating. Everybody was waiting to hear and to see what the Virginia Supreme Court would do. I'm not quite sure I could tell you that I would have guessed that that was the way in which they would have worded and done everything. So very interesting in how they did that. And of course, now we look forward to April to see ultimately what the voters will decide when it comes to this. There's going to be, as you said, a lot in between there, money that's going to be funneled in to try to get voters to swing one way or the other within this case. Do you expect to see anything else between now and maybe April that you think voters and everyone should kind of keep their eyes on, particularly when it comes to this fight?
I think we should all be watching what goes on in other states who are contemplating similar moves here, places like New York, because that is going to have bearing on what these Virginia maps mean overall. Again, I do think that we can't really separate out that for voters, this question is not going to be decided in a vacuum, right? Contemporary political events are going to influence how voters perceive this amendment, because what this amendment is essentially about is President Trump. Right. Passing the amendment is something that's going to weaken the president, and voting down the amendment is something that gives the president at least a better chance at maintaining the status quo. So just the environment that is around us politically is really intertwined with this map question. It's not a Virginia map question by itself.
And then you got to get people to actually vote, right? And that really becomes a big play in this when we're talking about the money that's already kind of being funneled into and talked about it. Can you get people to go on that April 21st or to vote on that April 21st deadline? And then the other deadlines, I guess we're still waiting to kind of come out here when it comes to that. Any other questions that you still have with this? You think it's like, I'm waiting to see what this does, anything that's still of interest to you when it comes to this conversation of these newly proposed congressional maps?
It's going to be really interesting to me to see how the parties address the kind of garnering support of their particular position around these maps. Just generally, I think you have Democrats in kind of a weird position because they're doing something that many of them would argue isn't good for a political reason. I think that's a hard argument to make to people, right? That, I'm doing this thing that you probably don't like and don't want the other side to do, but I'm doing it because I have to. Republicans are on a little stronger ground, I think, in the state of Virginia, being like, hey, this isn't how we want to do things. And I do think you're going to see a lot of discussion about the distinction between rural and urban voters here, because what these are aggressive. This is an aggressive map, right? What this does is it dilutes the power of rural voters across the state. You can't get around that. So that's going to be a major talking point here, and it'll be interesting to see how it resonates and what that does for turnout in areas where turnout isn't particularly high, and noting that special elections turnout's always kind of a mystery, and the people who turn out tend to be different than turn out for like a presidential election.
I truly think it'll be a big battle to see who actually comes out to vote for this. You were talking about the cell. We're hearing from Senator Louise Lucas right after this came out. She said, listen, these are not ordinary times, and Virginia will not sit on the sidelines while it happens. We made a promise to level the playing field, and today we are keeping our promise. And she has been very loud about that consistently, and in her fashion, striking back on people on social media as well about this. Sarah, if you can you pull that map back up? And, you talked about how the impact this could have on rural people within Virginia. I want to focus here in Hampton Roads, just looking at those areas. Now, we knew going into this that the 2nd Congressional District that is currently being held by Republican Congresswoman Jen Kiggans was likely going to be one of the ones that we saw impacted by this. Big fight already taking place in that district. Kiggans wants to keep it, but already has, Elaine Luria, who formerly was in that role, fighting to get it back on the Democratic side.